Hello, welcome back to The Professor Speaks. I'm Raphael Chacon, director of the Montana Museum of Art and Culture and a professor of art history and criticism at the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana in the Western United States. It's a pleasure to welcome you back to our series on Roman art and early Christian art. And this is the fifth lecture in that series. Today we discuss the fabulous and fascinating story of the first five Roman emperors and the descendants of Caesar Augustus on the imperial throne. So without much ado, let me turn on share my screen and turn on my PowerPoint so that we can begin our conversation. So we're going to be discuss today the Julio-Claudians, as this famous family is known. And this is a very interesting family of players, individuals who inherited the throne after the death of Caesar Augustus. Those individuals include the emperors Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero, some of the most famous and well-recorded emperors of Roman history. Certainly, as descendants of Caesar Augustus, they would play an enormous role in expanding the empire, in maintaining the power of and authority of the Romans throughout the Western hemisphere. Excuse me, the Western Europe. So the first five emperors, actually, their rule over the Roman Empire revealed two truths, in fact, about the old Roman Republic. That the first is that the Republic was really not a democratic or representative democracy, nor was it a republic in the modern sense of the term. In fact, it was more like an oligarchy, and it had always been such. That is, when you had ruling families who fought and maintained power and wealth and privilege by controlling the state or controlling the military, and sometimes doing both. These families were effectively the people who ruled Rome from the most ancient times up until the imperial period and up until the rise of these despotic tyrants, the emperors who ruled after Augustus. So in some ways it was no different, the fact that you had the Julio-Claudian family, that is the heirs of Caesar Augustus ruling. It was just that now there was no pretense that in fact that Rome was a republic. There was a sense that, in fact, these families did, in fact, control everything in the Roman world. So the first heir to Caesar Augustus was Tiberius. And you remember that, Caesar Augustus's wife, Livia, brought two sons to their marriage. And those two sons, Tiberius and Drusus, were the natural heirs or the logical heirs of Caesar Augustus. Tiberius was the second emperor after Augustus, and he actually began his rule as apparently as a beneficent ruler, but it ultimately became quite a despot. He's what historians tended to think of as a bad emperor. And by the way, let me tell you a little bit about the history of the good emperors versus the bad emperors. Most of those histories were written by contemporaries, and therefore they were biased, obviously, either in favor of the individual or opposed to the individual. And that depended, of course, on the political position of the person writing that. Much of the stories of these early emperors were also filtered through the life of the Christian church, that is, the early Roman Catholic Church. And the authors who, in fact, wrote about these emperors tended to see these individuals either as good or bad, depending on how they had treated the Christian community, at least how they felt or perceived that treatment to have been. So sometimes early Roman emperors who were benign in their treatment of Christians, or more or less left them alone, were considered good emperors, whereas the ones who harassed that early Christian community tended to be perceived as bad emperors. So what I'm saying is that you can't always trust the texts that we have describing the lives of these emperors, whether they were good or bad. More often than not, they were politically biased and therefore untrustworthy as documents go. Nevertheless, they reveal a great deal about the perceptions, either in favor or opposed, about these emperors. So Tiberius was born Tiberius Claudius Nero and he ultimately took the title Tiberius Julius Caesar Augustus. So you can see that when he became adopted by Caesar Augustus, then he claimed the lineage back to Julius Caesar in his own name. He was born in 42 BC, before the Common Era, and he died in 37 Common Era, or 37 AD. That is, that he lived a fairly long life, and he ruled for a long period. He ruled for 23 years, from the years 14 through 37. Along with Drusus, he was again the son of Livia Drusilla and Tiberius Claudius Nero, who was her first husband. He was not a direct descendant of Augustus, but he was the adopted son of Augustus. And Augustus adopted him in the year 4, when he was actually 46 years old. So again, these adoptions could take place at any point in a person's life, including at the mature age of 46. We know that he married a woman by the name of Vipsania, who was also from a descendant of the line of Agrippa, and that he adopted Drusus's son Germanicus. That is, Tiberius adopted Drusus's son Germanicus. He became emperor in 14 when Augustus died at the age of 56. So he was adopted at 46, and then he becomes emperor at the age of 56. And he dies in the year 37 at the ripe age of 78. This was a very, very long life for a Roman individual. And let's take a look at this family tree so that you can have a sense of how Tiberius is in fact was linked to Augustus. So here we see in the middle of this family tree, of this genealogical diagram, Augustus, and then his second wife, Livia. And then we see that Livia herself had been married. Her first marriage was to Tiberius Claudius Nero. And then she had a number of children, including Tiberius Drusus, the two boys. And in fact, Augustus adopts, and that's what this dotted line means, adopted Tiberius, who will then go on to marry Vipsania. And this is, in fact, how he is a direct heir or direct link to Augustus, much like Augustus was a direct heir and link to Julius Caesar by way of adoption. And here is, in fact, a golden coin, an aureus, which shows us the likeness of Tiberius on the left, and then an image of Livia, seated Livia, his mother, on the other side of the coin. Again, the coin emphasizes his connection to that first family of the empire, that is Augustus and Livia. And here's another interesting likeness. This is a colossal portrait of him. This is only the head of it, which is in the Chiaramonti Museum in Italy. And it was discovered in 1811 in the town of Veii. And on the left, you see an image of that as it's been colored. And I mentioned earlier that many of these images were originally painted, brightly painted or naturalistically painted. And based on the pigments still discovered, if you will, on the surface of this sculpture, we know that the image on the right looks something like what you see there on the left. So, and there are some other great likenesses of Tiberius. There were just in the same tradition of having imperial images of the emperor, as we see with the thousands of images of Augustus. We also have the likeness of Tiberius. So the one on the left is in Copenhagen, and the one on the right in Minorca, one of the Spanish islands. So his portraits were ubiquitous across the empire, east and west, north and south, much as Augustus's images were before him. This cameo that I showed you in an earlier lecture, the so-called Grand Cameo of France, and we described that as having an image of Augustus with his wife Livia in the center. But some scholars have actually argued that this is not an image of Augustus and Livia, but rather it's an image of Tiberius and Livia. And that's based on the kind of the older image of Livia here. So this could in fact be an image of Livia, the mother, and Tiberius, her son. And the image that we see up above flying to the heavens might be in fact the divinized Augustus. And that's one very interesting interpretation of this cameo, that rather than showing us Livia and her husband Augustus and then his image up in the heavens above, that actually what we're seeing is her and her son, and then her divinized husband actually in the heavens above in the company of other gods. So a very interesting image. And here's another very large triumphant image of the robed Tiberius, and this one comes from the island of Capri off the western coast of the Italian peninsula. So lots and lots of imperial portraits of the emperor, much like you had in the life of Augustus. You will now find them with the likeness of Tiberius, and he had a very distinctive face, so we know it's him and not his father. Here's another one. This is a very interesting photograph. It's a 19th century photograph from a stereopticon, which photographed an object, a sculpture, with two lenses. And then when those two lenses were combined and the image was viewed through this gadget called the stereopticon, it looked like a 3D image. Nevertheless, the image shows us a seated image of Tiberius, and this is a wonderful portrait of him as a ruler that is currently in the Vatican Museum in Italy, or in Vatican State. Now, Tiberius did build, of course, over a long period, his long reign, and one of the more interesting constructions was his own personal villa on the coast of Italy, near the town of Sperlonga. And that image that you see there of the beach on the lower left is actually not far from where Tiberius owned a very extensive and dramatic villa. And these are the ruins of that along the beach there. And one thing that you have to remember is that Rome as a city proper was a kind of nasty place in the summers. It became very, very hot, and Romans tended to flee, at least aristocratic Romans who could afford to leave the hot and muggy, humid, and stinky air of Rome in the summers, would often go to the coast, would go to the shore, not too far from the city, but just far enough to get away from the bad air and the bad climate. And so it was not unusual for someone like Tiberius to build himself a villa along the coast. And here is the villa at Sperlonga. And you see the ruins here in the center of the screen, and also a very interesting harbor. There is, in fact, a breakwater here, a beach, a sandy beach, and then the remnants or the foundations of a very interesting structure, which you can see in the diagram that you see here. What there is along this cliff wall were two natural caves, two very large grottos, if you will. And the ocean would come in, and the ocean did come in and carve these things out. Eventually, those caves were regularized to create a pool, a saltwater pool, where the water would enter. And in fact, it would surround a very interesting portion of the villa. So to the north here, you see actually the largest part of the villa, it's proper. But then below you would see a basin of water, and that is of course seawater from the ocean itself. And then this wonderful sort of area here where you had a circular area carved out in the middle of that grotto, or below the grotto, if you will, or the cave. And then an area, a dining room, actually a floating dining room, if you will, in the middle of that structure. So when Tiberius and his family dined, and his guests dined, they dined in this triclinium, or this beautiful dining hall that was surrounded by water, like a watery moat. In fact, they had to probably get in a small watercraft to actually get access to that. So it was a kind of folly, an imperial folly, a royal folly for this king. Now, Tiberius actually intended, it was believed that, of course, the natural heir to his throne would be Drusus, but Drusus did not live long enough to rule. So the power would flow directly to Germanicus, his son, whom Tiberius would adopt. And so Tiberius adopted his nephew, Germanicus, who then becomes his adoptive son. And Germanicus was thought to be the natural heir and the next ruler after Tiberius finished his reign. Well, that didn't happen because Germanicus dies. And then Tiberius actually planned for his grandson, Drusus Caesar, to in fact inherit the throne. And Drusus Caesar was the son of Germanicus and Agrippina. And Drusus Caesar, of course, didn't live long enough to inherit the throne either. Therefore, it passed to his grandson, a very famous and important ruler, and that was Caligula, Gaius Caesar. And so, in fact, the throne actually skips over 2 generations to the grandson, Caligula. And that's where the story of this famous family continues. But first, let me show you Germanicus, Tiberius's adopted son. And this is a portrait of him as a young child. And remember, he is the grandson of Livia, the son of Drusus, and a woman by the name of Antonia Minor. And this bust was discovered in 1844. And then Tiberius's own son, Germanicus' own son, Drusus Caesar, is shown in the portrait that you see here. And then another hopeful successor, but one who lived too short a life in order to become the heir. Now, Germanicus married a woman by the name of Agrippina the Elder. And Agrippina and Germanicus are shown here in this marvelous painting by Peter Paul Rubens, done in the 17th century. Of course, Rubens lived 1,500 years after these Roman emperors, so this is a fantasy on his part, but it's in part based on portraits of these individuals that do exist, marble portraits of these rulers. So again, the parents, Agrippina the Elder and Germanicus, and here we see actually the 2 most important members, if you will, of Tiberius's family. On the left, his wife Vipsania, and then on the right, his nephew and adopted son, Germanicus. And then this is, in fact, the son of Agrippina and Germanicus, and his name is Caligula. And so we have a bust portrait of the young Caligula, who becomes the heir of Tiberius. Now, he has a very interesting name. The name it derives from a nickname, actually, and that is the Roman word for a military sandal or boot known as the caliga. And Caligula means little boot, and that is actually the nickname that Caligula earned during his training as a soldier in the Roman army. Caligula has a reputation, a very poor reputation, actually. He's considered a bad emperor. He was as despotic as his father, if not more so. And in fact, some historians actually argue that Caligula was mentally ill. He was born in the year 12. He was born Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. Remember, Germanicus is in fact his father. And he ruled a very short period from the year 37 to the year 41. He was the son of Nero Claudius Drusus Germanicus and Agrippina the Elder, as we noted earlier. He assumed the throne at the age of 25 in the year 37 upon the death of Tiberius, and he was a very, very rich and very powerful emperor. He received half of his father's estate in 37. But he didn't last long because he was assassinated by the very guards who were there to protect him. So the Praetorian Guard, under a man by the name of Cassius Chaerea, assassinated Caligula, and that's how he ended his very short rule. There are some very interesting portraits of Caligula, like the one that you see here, and this one is in Copenhagen, which has a fabulous Roman collection. And there you see him, a kind of triumphal image of him wearing a military uniform decorated with all kinds of gear, celebrating his station as a military man. And there's also a number of cameo portraits of him. This is one of him showing him with a goddess enthroned as well. So this is that tradition that goes back to Augustus. Showing the emperor seated, surrounded by deities. And again, remember, these stones were passed down from emperor to emperor to emperor to emperor, eventually to medieval kings, and eventually wound up in royal collections like the Habsburg collection in Vienna. So the setting that you see here is in fact a modern setting. It is not the actual ancient image that would have been perceived by Caligula and his family. Here's another marvelous portrait. This one is in the Louvre showing the young Caligula. And this is the way we tend to remember him based on portraits like this. Very distinctive image of the young man who would eventually become emperor. Now, with the death of Caligula, or the assassination of Caligula, the family tree changes because we have no direct heir from Caligula. So we have to go back to the line, not Tiberius's line, but Drusus's line. So Claudius, who is the next emperor, was born Tiberius Claudius Drusus Nero Germanicus. And I know these names are now starting to merge, because what you find often is you have individuals who have the names of their ancestors as their official name, and but have to be distinguished from them. And so the one distinctive name here is Claudius, and that's how he's remembered, even though he bears the name of Drusus and Tiberius and Germanicus. Anyway, he was the grandson of Livia, and by way of her son Drusus. So Drusus is his father. And he is considered a good emperor by many historians. We know that he was favored by the Senate, and the accounts, and again, you have to take these accounts with grains of salt, they tell us that he revived republican values. Now, other more contemporary historians will tell you that he ruled as ruthlessly as any of the others. He was, in fact, a military man who did a great deal to expand the empire and fought many wars. And yet he was considered successful by the Senate and by many of his contemporaries. And they talked up his virtues, particularly his republican values. Nevertheless, he was an emperor, and he ruled like a despot, like the despots before him and the despots after. He was born in 10 BC and he died in 54, and he ruled from 41 to 54. That was a 13-year rule. So after Tiberius, he is the next ruler, the next emperor to have a fairly long amount of time in which to get some things done. So he died at 51 in the year 54, and there are some accounts that he was in fact murdered by Agrippina the Younger. And by the way, I should note here, again, if the stories of the Roman emperors are suspect, both in contemporary texts and later accounts, the accounts of their wives, their spouses, their mothers, their daughters, etc., are equally suspect. And again, these women were subject to the writings of mostly male authors, and some of them were quite biased, not just against women, but against these particular women. If they had biases against their husbands or their the male rulers, then they certainly had biases against the female characters. So these biographies of the women at the court are suspect, to say the least. So, but nevertheless, there's this account that Agrippina the Younger, or the Minor, as she was known, was in fact the person responsible for his death. He was a great builder. We know that he accomplished much in those 13 years. He built an enormous gateway known as the Porta Maggiore, which is still in Rome today, and I'll show you an image of that shortly. He built a harbor on the Tiber, a very, very impressive and important construction for maritime navigation in Western Italy. He built an enormous aqueduct known as the Claudian Aqueduct, and he also fought some successful wars, particularly in Britain, in Germany, Syria, and Mauritania in North Africa. So again, let's locate Claudius. So remember that the throne passed from Augustus to Tiberius here in the center of the screen, and it would have passed through Germanicus, and it would have passed through Drusus Caesar, but instead went from Tiberius to his grandson Caligula, whom you see here. But upon the death of Caligula, or the assassination of Caligula, the throne then passed over to this side of the family, Claudius, who was in fact the son of Drusus and Antonia, who was the son in turn of Livia and Tiberius Claudius Nero. So her first husband, not Augustus, her second husband. So Livia was the mother of Drusus and Tiberius, and Drusus was the father of Claudius. So Claudius was in fact a direct descendant from Caesar Augustus by way of his wife, Livia. Okay, so I want to show you two modern images, modern paintings, although these were done in the 19th century, and these were both done by the great British painter Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema, who was a kind of historicist painter who had a very vivid imagination, but also was quite interested in Roman archaeology and Roman history. And so we see that great attention to detail and certainly the use of Roman art as the backdrop of his great paintings, his sweeping sort of historical epic paintings. In this image that you see here, we see Caligula dead on the floor and a curtain being drawn. And behind that curtain is Claudius. Now, of course, the British loved Claudius because he was, in fact, the supposed one of the great conquerors of Britain. He spent time there and he warred there. But Claudius was an interesting character to them. Here we show him, in fact, at the moment where Caligula is being murdered, being in the same room to witness it. And according to anecdote, he was there but hiding behind a curtain, a most undecorous place for a would-be emperor to be. And yet the Praetorian Guard apparently admired Claudius. We don't know this for sure, or maybe they thought he could be an easily manipulated emperor, but they apparently declared him emperor on the spot. And that's the image that you see here in this marvelous image by Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema, the 19th century British painter. Here's another version of that same story told by Sir Lawrence Alma-Tadema. Again, he is being found hiding behind the curtain and being declared emperor by the Praetorian Guard. Again, this anecdote is highly suspicious, but it may in fact have happened that way. We just don't know. This is a coin that was minted by Claudius, actually, or by the state, upon his assumption of the imperial throne. So it's an image of Claudius on the left, and it shows a very interesting goddess on the right. That is Pax Nemesis. And Pax Nemesis is a goddess who represents peace. And in fact, actually, a better translation is subdued vengeance. One of the things that was to be expected was that a new Roman emperor would clean house, and he would do that through political assassinations or purges. That is, in fact, shoring up his support base and, in fact, eliminating his enemies. Apparently, Claudius didn't do that. He showed a great deal of benevolence, and after assuming his death, he did not punish the murders of Caligula or punish his enemies. In fact, he was known for being actually a good emperor. Again, take that with a grain of salt. But the coins actually show the use of this goddess and association with him. Therefore, there might be some truth to this, that he in fact was an emperor who showed some mercy. And by the way, he was a most improbable emperor because one of the things that we know about him is that he was short in stature and that he also walked with a gimp. Apparently, he had a problem leg. So he was not the kind of robust, heroic individual that was expected. He was not a Tiberius, nor was he an Augustus. He was, in fact, a frail of body, and that is also accounted for in the early histories. He was not a physically robust individual, and therefore was an improbable emperor, and yet he still ruled for a long period and ruled successfully. Here's another interesting coin. This is an aureus, a golden coin, showing him on the right, portrait of him. And again, these are generic portraits, both male and female. And the figure on the left is his wife, Agrippina the Younger, who supposedly murdered him. So this is another marvelous gem, and this is another cameo. And this one is also in Vienna, part of the Habsburg treasury that the marvelous Kunsthistorisches Museum possesses today. And this is known as the Gemma Claudia because it features in it Claudius with his wife Agrippina the Younger, or the Minor, on the left. And then on the right, it shows Germanicus with Agrippina the Elder. So it has his parents as well as his marriage. So two marriages here. And by the way, there's the eagle of Zeus in the middle of this cameo, sort of, so you have the kind of the blessings of the gods over this royal household, this imperial household. So we have father and son with both of their spouses. Very, very interesting image. And then we have bust portraits, of course, of Claudius. For example, these are the one on the left is in Copenhagen, the one on the right in Madrid, that show us a fairly consistent portrait of the man. So this is Claudius as he probably looked in life. So these are kind of veristic images of the man. And again, the one on the right in bronze is quite rare because of its materials. So I think we can trust that this is a fairly good likeness. Again, the marbles are less trustworthy because they were easier to copy and less expensive, if you will, in material. And so the copies tend to be more generic than the bronzes. Again, two other marble images, the one on the left in the Nie Carlsberg Glyptothek in Copenhagen, and the one on the right in the Clementine Museum in the Vatican Museum as well in Rome. Or outside of Rome. The likeness on the one on the right is more sketchy, if you will. It looks less and less like the images that you've just seen in the other bust portraits. Here is a marvelous statue of him as a warrior relinquishing his sword. You can see that gesture in his left hand where he's actually handing back the sword, the imperial sword. But what is improbable and unlikely here is the kind of Adonis or godlike body. So it was not uncommon to have individuals wearing or bust portraits, that is the bust, the facial likeness to be consistent and naturalistic, but the bodies being the bodies of gods, of young athletes or deities. This was a kind of interesting concept, and yet it was pretty ubiquitous in the Roman world. To us, it rings fatuous, it rings kind of silly, but again, it's part of that whole propagandistic value that these portraits played. The idea was not so much that in real life Claudius was a warrior or Claudius was of a beautiful and heroic body, but that he in fact embodied those traits, those godlike traits. Here's another one. This is a spectacular image, a spectacular sculpture in the Vatican Museum as well. Again, the facial portrait is quite consistent with many of the other ones that we recognize, but the body is a body of a god and therefore not his actual body. There was a temple to Claudius in Rome, and you can see the arches of that temple or the foundations of that temple today. It's a ruin. It's been mostly unexcavated, but there are parts of it that are still visible to the public today on the streets of Rome. But this is really his great architectural accomplishment. In addition to the aqueduct that comes into the city, there's this marvelous, marvelous gate known as the Porta Maggiore, or the Great Door, the Great Gate of Rome, and it's still in usage today, and it has survived these 2,000 years. It's a marvelous, marvelous testament to the reign of Claudius. So the next emperor to rule after Claudius is Nero, and of course Nero has been celebrated in history, both ancient and more modern histories, as one of the worst emperors of all time. And of course, in no small part because there were a great fire that burned through the city of Rome during his reign, which has been attributed to him. And then, of course, we've all heard the story of Nero playing his fiddle or his lyre as Rome burned. It's become kind of part of common parlance today. There's a lot that's doubtful about that story, but not about Nero being an unpopular ruler. And he was unpopular for many reasons, and less than successful as a ruler. He was born Nero Claudius Caesar Drusus Germanicus, and again, he has shares many of the names with his predecessor Claudius as emperor, and yet he went by the name Nero. He was born in 37 and died in 68. A short life, and according to historians, a short and debauched life. He ruled from 54 to 68, and he was considered one of the bad emperors. He was the son of Agrippina the Younger and Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. In a minute, I'll show you that in the family tree. So he was the son of Agrippina in her first marriage, but he was adopted by Claudius, and that's how he actually gained access to the throne. He succeeded Claudius when he was only 17 years of age. So he was a very, very young man, probably ill-equipped to rule the empire. And then in the year 68, he was declared an enemy of the state and committed suicide, and more than likely he was forced to commit suicide in the year 68. So again, let's follow the family tree on the right side. So remember that Claudius was the son of Drusus, who was the brother of Tiberius. And so the throne passes from Augustus, Tiberius, to Caligula, but then after the death of Caligula, it jumps over to Claudius, the heir of Drusus. And Claudius adopts Nero. And Nero was in fact Agrippina's son with Gnaeus Domitius Ahenobarbus. So he was not Claudius's biological heir, but he was indeed his adopted heir, as you can see from the dotted line here. So Nero is the last of the Julio-Claudians, the last descendant of Augustus by way of Livia, Drusus, Claudius. Okay, so let us proceed to talk a little bit, to look at some images of Nero. The portrait of him on the left, which is in the Palatine, which comes from the Palatine in Rome, shows him as a young man. But we typically see him like we do here on the right, and that is a kind of full face, kind of thick-necked individual, and that's how we would tend to remember Nero. We don't remember him looking like Augustus over here. We remember him looking like the image that you see from the Glyptotek in Munich on the right. In fact, here's two other portraits of him. One actually this is the same one in the Capitoline Museum in Rome, just two different views of him. Again, sort of thick-necked, and actually for the first time sporting a beard, which is something we haven't seen in any of the Roman emperors prior to this. So this is the image of Nero as we tend to remember him. A fuller, more doughy face is what we see here, and this thick neck, and a beard, or at least the appearance of a burgeoning beard, a beard coming on. But history has tended to remind us of Nero like this, and this is the British painter John William Waterhouse, and this is called Nero's Remorse. This was painted in 1878, and again, it's one of these fantastic historicist images from the 19th century, and it shows the young Nero as a troubled young man on the throne. The city is presumably burning outside, and he's not quite in full control of the situation. This is the way we tend to remember Nero. Or this marvelous Russian painting of the death of Nero. This is Vasily Smirnov, and this was done not long after Waterhouse's painting. This is the death of Nero. We see basically the suicide of Nero. And again, whether this was a forced event or whether this was something that was of his own doing, it happened. And so this is the way Nero met his fate in the end. So what you see here is his spouse looking down on him, and the women that have come, the lictors that have come to take his body away. One of the more interesting things that Nero left us is the trappings of his the wealth and power and the magnificence of his reign. He actually ruled in a splendid fashion, actually, and there's some evidence, some signs of that. Even though upon his death, the Romans tended to want to erase his history, and there is this concept of the damnatio memoriae, to erase the memory of, or to damn the memory, literally damn the memory of this individual. Nero's history, the successors wanted to erase his history, the history of what they considered a bad reign. And they did that by destroying the monuments that he built, including his own personal palace. He built an enormous home, an enormous palace at the end of the Roman, Forum. And that palace, which was called the Domus Aurea, or the Golden Home, the Golden Palace, was rediscovered in the Renaissance, that is in the early 16th century. Apparently, an individual literally fell through the vaults of the house. Now, that was only a small fragment of the palace, because the palace apparently ran more or less underneath the area of the Colosseum today, from the Palatine Hill all the way to the neighboring hill underneath what we call the Colosseum today. That palace was destroyed upon his death, upon his suicide. But fragments of the palace, certain rooms of it, were in fact excavated, or at least rediscovered in the Renaissance. And here are some of the details, some of the beautiful paintings that you see, the frescoed paintings. Again, that tradition of living in a palace that was splendidly painted or beautifully appointed by artists goes back to Augustus. And in fact, it continues all the way at the end of the rule of the Julio-Claudians, in the rule of Nero. That home, by the way, has just recently opened to the public, or at least the remnant rooms of it. And it shows us, in fact, a splendid place. That's not so much visible in this image that you see here, which just shows us the brick walls and then some of the plaster work, with most of the painting now long faded, because this building has been exposed since the 16th century. But restorers in recent years have been working quite attentively to restore and to bring back the original color of those frescoes. And here you see it in some of the remnant rooms of the Golden House of Nero's palace. That palace, by the way, had an enormous lake in it, and there is some debate as to whether it was just in contemporaries of Nero, and writers not long after his death described it as opulent, as corrupt, as a place of the greediest of all emperors, as a kind of city within the city that was closed off to the public. But more recent historians have found evidence that, in fact, it was more open to the public than we believe, that it was built more like a park for the Romans to enjoy than it was as a kind of private compound of the rich and the famous. Some more views of Nero's Golden House, and some of the beautiful vaulting that you see there on the right with the frescoes. Again, these frescoes are very damaged because they have been exposed for the last half a millennium, but nevertheless they give us a sense of the beauty of this palace. And more than likely, Nero had a great hand in the construction and the design and the decoration of these spaces. There's one last monument that I want to show you, which is really kind of intriguing. These are very large bronze heads of Medusa, plaques, if you will, that were the decorations of Nero's ships, two of which were discovered on a lake not far from Rome, and that is Lake Nemi. And the lake actually looks like this, and as you can see, is an ancient volcanic crater that has filled in. And it was there where, in the 1930s, two enormous boats that dated to Nero's rule were excavated. These were excavated by the Ministry of Culture under Benito Mussolini, again, a modern dictator who had a great interest in the Roman emperors and put a lot of money and energy into restoring their status in world history. And here you see these marvelous photographs of these ships as they were being unexcavated in the 1930s. Sadly enough, these two ships were placed in a museum that burned to the ground, and therefore we lost these two incredible, impressive structures from the ancient world. But some of the decorations actually had been removed, and those things are still alive, including those masquettes of the heads of Medusa that I showed you. Those masquettes surrounded the ship on the outside, sort of as warnings to the enemies of the emperor. So you had these protective deities in bronze plaques surrounding the structure. And this is the way historians hypothesize that those ships may have looked at the time of Nero. They were entire floating cities, if you will, or floating palaces, if you will, with gardens and temples and statues and banners and all kinds of decorations and amenities for the emperor and the royal family. So on that note, we will leave the ostentatious Julio-Claudians, a kind of troubled family, but nevertheless the heirs of that lineage, the legacy of Caesar Augustus, the first five emperors who ruled the Roman state in that first century AD. So on that note, we'll say goodbye, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you.